The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. Every eye was glued to the screen where grainy security footage played. A man stepped out of the stolen Mercedes-Benz, his face hidden, movements casual, almost careless. But one detail was unmistakable. He wore a navy blue jacket. Elijah sat at the defense table, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the screen. His jaw tightened, emotion flickering behind his calm exterior. He rose slowly, his shoulders squared, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet intensity. "If that's me, then why is he wearing a different jacket?" The room went completely silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Faces turned to the screen, searching for explanations that weren't there. Confusion rippled through the room, whispers of doubt echoing softly. The judge's gavel hovered midair, his eyes wide with shock, the authority in his hand momentarily forgotten. Grant's face went pale, his confidence shattered, his voice cracked, trembling. This can't be. That's impossible." Elijah's gaze held firm, his voice cold and steady. "Or maybe you never really saw me at all." The screen flickered and cut to black, leaving the truth hanging heavy and undeniable. Stay till the end to see how justice fights against prejudice. If you believe in justice, hit subscribe and share this story with the world. The courtroom was heavy with tension, every whisper echoing off the cold, towering walls. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, its golden glow starkly contrasting the unforgiving atmosphere within. The room was filled with faces, curious, judgmental, indifferent, all focused on one figure sitting at the defense table, Elijah Thompson. Elijah sat upright, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly before him. His face was calm, composed, but his eyes revealed a depth of emotion that he fought to contain. At 20 years old, Elijah had learned to carry the weight of judgment long before this day. Born to Amanda Thompson, a fierce and resilient single mother, Elijah grew up knowing that people saw his skin before they saw his truth. He had faced prejudice all his life, but today was different. Today, those biases were armed with accusations that could take away his freedom. He looked around the courtroom, meeting eyes filled with suspicion and disdain. No one knew him, yet they had already labeled him guilty, not because of evidence, but because of preconceived notions and stereotypes that clung to him like a shadow. He felt their judgments pressing down on him, suffocating and heavy, but Elijah held his head high, refusing to bow to the weight of their expectations. The charges were severe: grand theft auto for allegedly stealing a Mercedes-Benz, and obstruction of justice for questioning the authority of the police. The consequences were terrifying, but what frightened Elijah more was the realization that his innocence alone would not be enough. He was not just fighting against allegations. He was battling a system built on prejudice and a room full of minds already made up. Maxwell Grant, the prosecutor, stood across the room with a smug look of confidence. To him, this was just another easy win, another conviction to add to his record. He looked at Elijah with a condescending smirk, not seeing a young man fighting for his future, but a target, an easy statistic. The arrogance in Grant's eyes ignited a fire in Elijah's chest, fueling his resolve. Beside Elijah sat Michael Warren, the public defender assigned to his case. Disheveled and uninterested, Michael glanced at his phone, barely looking at his client. He leaned in, his voice low and dismissive. "Take the plea, kid. You're not gonna beat this." His words were cold, laced with apathy, and they hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. Elijah looked at him, searching for hope, for someone who believed him, but all he found was indifference. In that moment, Elijah knew he was truly alone. The system was against him, the world was against him, and even his own defender had already given up. But Elijah refused to surrender. His jaw clenched, his hands tightened into fists. He felt the familiar sting of injustice. the bitter taste of prejudice that he had endured his entire life. But he wouldn't let it consume him. He wouldn't let them silence his truth. If no one would fight for him, then he would fight for himself. The room was silent as Elijah stood, his shoulders squared, his eyes fierce with determination. Every face turned towards him, some with curiosity, others with contempt. But Elijah saw through them, saw the doubts and biases lurking behind their eyes, and he was ready to shatter every one of them. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Elijah Thompson would not be defeated. Elijah sat at the defense table, his shoulders squared, his expression unwavering. His eyes were fixed on the screen where the grainy security footage played, showing him standing near the stolen Mercedes-Benz. It was only a brief moment, but the angle made him look suspicious. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him, the whispers of doubt echoing around the room. Maxwell Grant, the prosecutor, stepped forward with a smug confidence that radiated from every word he spoke. The evidence is clear. Security footage places the defendant at the scene of the crime. He pointed to the screen, pausing dramatically to let the image sink in. There he is, standing right next to the stolen vehicle, looking around, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Elijah's jaw tightened, his fists clenching under the table. He knew why he was there. He was waiting for his friend. Nothing more. But Grant's words twisted the truth, painting him as a criminal before he even had a chance to speak. Grant continued, his voice dripping with certainty. And if that's not enough, we have a witness who saw him at the parking lot, loitering suspiciously. An elderly man took the stand, his voice firm as he testified. I saw him there, just standing around looking like he was up to no good. Whispers rippled through the room, faces turning towards Elijah, eyes narrowing with suspicion. Elijah felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding as he struggled to keep his composure. He looked to his left, where Michael Warren, the public defender assigned to his case, sat silently, his face expressionless. Michael stood up, clearing his throat before mumbling, Your Honor, my client was merely waiting for a friend. There's no evidence to suggest any wrongdoing. His voice was weak, uninspired, and his argument fell flat. He didn't bother to elaborate or press the witness. It was clear he was only going through the motions. His eyes were empty, devoid of any passion or belief in Elijah's innocence. The judge looked unimpressed, his gaze shifting from Michael to Elijah with a mixture of pity and contempt. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, faces filled with judgment. Elijah could feel their eyes piercing through him, already deciding his fate. Grant smirked, crossing his arms as he spoke with mock sympathy. A friend? Convenient story. Yet, no one's come forward to confirm this friend's existence. The judge turned to Michael, his voice stern. Do you have any witnesses to corroborate your client's claim? Michael looked down, his shoulders slumping as he shook his head. No, Your Honor, no witnesses. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Elijah's fists tightened, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to control his anger. He looked at Michael, his eyes pleading for help. But Michael avoided his gaze, his face void of emotion. He had already given up. The judge sighed, his voice heavy with disapproval. Without supporting evidence, this defense is nothing more than speculation. Grant's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with victory. Exactly. This is just a desperate attempt to distract from the facts. Elijah felt a knot tighten in his chest, his breathing growing heavy. He was alone in a room full of people who saw him as nothing more than a criminal. Alone against a prosecutor who had already won in his mind. Alone, even with a lawyer by his side. But he wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting against the prejudice that had judged him guilty, long before he walked into this room. He wouldn't let them take his voice. He wouldn't let them define his truth. He stood up, his back straight, his eyes fierce with determination. "Your Honor, I will represent myself." The room fell silent. Every face turned towards him, eyes wide with shock. Then laughter, mocking, condescending laughter. The judge raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You think you're a lawyer? This isn't a school debate, kid." Grant laughed openly, shaking his head in disbelief. "A street kid playing lawyer. This should be entertaining," Michael scoffed, gathering his papers without even looking at Elijah. He didn't say a word as he walked out. His shoulders relaxed, his posture casual. It was clear he had never cared. Elijah stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady and strong. "I'm not playing anything. I'm fighting for my truth." The courtroom fell silent again, his words echoing off the walls, hanging heavy in the air. Elijah looked around at the faces staring back at him. Some curious, others scornful, but all underestimating him. He took a deep breath, his shoulders squared, his resolve solidified. He would prove them wrong. He would make them see him, really see him, for the first time. And he would fight until his truth was heard. Elijah stood tall, his shoulders squared, his eyes fierce with determination. His voice was steady, unwavering as he looked directly at Judge Pierce. "Your Honor, I request the full surveillance footage be shown, not just the selected angle the prosecution presented." Grant's face visibly paled. His eyes darted to the screen and then back to Elijah, his confidence wavering. He opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. The judge raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Mr. Grant, do you have any objections?" Grant hesitated, his jaw tightening. He forced a smile, his voice strained. "No, Your Honor. But this is a waste of time. We've already seen enough." Judge Pierce's gaze hardened. "This court is obligated to view all relevant evidence. Play the full footage." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the screen flickered, the grainy security footage resuming. But this time, it was from a different angle, showing a wider perspective of the parking lot. The tension was palpable, every eye glued to the screen. The footage played, showing the stolen Mercedes-Benz parked under a dim street lamp. A man approached the car, his movements swift and deliberate. He was wearing a navy blue jacket and a baseball cap, his face obscured by shadows. The camera followed his movements, showing him unlocking the car door and sliding into the driver's seat. Then, the man looked around before starting the engine. Elijah's voice was calm, cutting through the silence. "If I was wearing black, why is he wearing blue?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Faces turned towards Grant, eyes wide with shock. The judge leaned forward, his gavel momentarily forgotten as his gaze shifted to Grant. Grant's face turned ashen, his confidence crumbling. He stammered, his voice cracking. This must be a mistake." Elijah's gaze was cold, unyielding. "A mistake, or a lie?" The room erupted in murmurs, shockwaves rippling through the audience. Grant's hands trembled as he flipped through his papers, his composure slipping. He looked at the screen, his eyes wide with disbelief as the footage looped, showing the man in the navy blue jacket once more. Grant's voice wavered, panic creeping in. This isn't possible. I didn't." Elijah's voice was calm but piercing. "You didn't think anyone would notice?" Grant's face flushed, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. He looked at the judge, desperation in his eyes. "Your Honor, this doesn't prove anything." Judge Pierce's gaze was steely. "It proves that you selectively chose evidence to fit your narrative. This is serious misconduct, Mr. Grant." Grant's confidence shattered. He stumbled over his words, his voice frantic. I didn't. It was a mistake." Elijah took a step forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "A mistake? or a deliberate attempt to deceive this court? The room fell silent again, the weight of Elijah's words pressing down on everyone. The screen continued to play, showing the man in the navy blue jacket driving away. It was clear now. Elijah wasn't the person in that footage. Grant's face went pale, his bravado completely shattered. His hands shook as he tried to regain control, his voice cracking. "You're just a punk who thinks he's smarter than the system." Elijah didn't flinch. His voice was calm, resolute. "I'm just someone who believes the truth matters, even when no one else does." The courtroom was silent, the tension suffocating. The audience looked at Elijah, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. For the first time, they saw him, not as a criminal, but as a young man fighting against prejudice and injustice. Judge Pierce's expression softened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Grant. There was no hiding it now. The evidence was clear, and the deceit was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted. Grant's confidence crumbled further. His hands were shaking as he rifled through his documents, his face pale and sweaty. He looked at Elijah, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. He whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "How could this kid corner me like this? This wasn't supposed to happen." Elijah watched Grant's facade fall apart, his own emotions swirling within him. He felt the familiar sting of prejudice, the weight of being judged before being heard. His eyes flicked to the audience, seeing faces that had once looked at him with contempt, now watching him with curiosity, even respect. His chest tightened, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He had fought so hard, not just against the accusations, but against a system built to see him fail. He took a deep breath, his jaw clenching as he steadied himself. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "They see my skin before they see my truth. But today, I'll make them see the truth first." His words hung in the air, a powerful declaration of his resolve. The room was silent, every face turned towards him, every eye watching as he stood tall, unbroken. Elijah's gaze shifted to Grant, his eyes fierce and determined. "I have one more piece of evidence, and it changes everything." The room collectively gasped, shock rippling through the crowd. Grant's face went pale, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at Elijah, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. The fear was palpable. The screen went dark, cutting to black as the tension reached its peak. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Elijah's words lingering, the truth echoing in every corner. The battle was far from over, and the next move was his. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Every face was turned toward the screen, eyes wide with anticipation. Elijah stood tall, his shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering. He had made his promise. The truth is coming. And it changes everything. The projector hummed, and the screen flickered to life. The security footage resumed, picking up exactly where it had left off. This time, it continued beyond the abrupt cutoff, revealing the crucial moments that had been conveniently hidden. The camera angle was wide, showing a clear view of the parking lot and the stolen Mercedes-Benz under the dim street lamp. The man approached the car, his movements calm and composed. He wore a navy blue jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He walked confidently, his posture relaxed, his demeanor casual. He glanced around once before unlocking the door and sliding into the driver's seat without hesitation. But just as he closed the door, he turned his head, and the light from the street lamp illuminated his face. The room collectively gasped. It was not Elijah. The man's face was clearly visible, sharp features, a square jaw, and eyes that were undeniably different from Elijah's. He was older, his build broader, his expression calm and calculated. The resemblance to Elijah was superficial at best. Same height, similar build, but the differences were unmistakable. Elijah's voice was steady, cold, his words cutting through the silence. "If that's me, then who is he?" The question hung heavy in the air, echoing off the walls. Faces turned toward the screen again, eyes narrowing as they scrutinized the footage. The man's face was clear, his identity unmistakable. Confusion rippled through the courtroom, whispers of shock and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Grant's face went ashen, his mouth falling open as his confidence crumbled. His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Elijah, panic creeping into his expression. He stuttered, his voice cracking. This can't be. That's impossible." Elijah's gaze was fierce, his posture strong and unyielding. "You were so eager to see me as the criminal. You didn't even look for the truth." The words struck like lightning. Faces turned toward Grant, eyes wide with accusation. Murmurs of anger and betrayal buzzed through the gallery. Judge Pierce leaned forward, his gavel frozen midair, his face pale with realization. His voice was low, cold. "Mr. Grant, did you knowingly withhold this evidence from the court?" Grant's body shook, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table for support. His voice was weak, his confidence shattered. I didn't know." Elijah's voice was sharp, piercing. "You knew. You just didn't care. You saw what you wanted to see." Grant stumbled backward, his legs giving way. His face turned ghostly white, his shoulders slumping, his arrogance crumbling. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the room, seeing faces filled with judgment and contempt. For the first time, he felt the weight of accusation pressing down on him. The judge's gavel came down hard, his voice thunderous. "This is prosecutorial misconduct. You withheld crucial evidence to mislead this court. The case is dismissed. The defendant is free to go." The words echoed through the room, heavy and final. The gallery fell silent, faces frozen in shock, eyes wide with disbelief. Elijah stood motionless, his chest rising and falling as the weight of relief washed over him. He looked around, meeting the eyes of people who, moments before, had judged him guilty without question. Their faces were downcast, their gazes falling away as his eyes met theirs. The weight of prejudice had shifted, the truth shattering their assumptions. Elijah took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. His posture was strong, his presence powerful. The light streaming through the tall windows bathed him in a golden glow, illuminating his face with a quiet dignity. He walked out of the courtroom, his head held high, his steps steady. As he passed Grant, he paused, his voice low but firm. "You saw my skin, but you never saw me." Grant's shoulders sagged, his head hanging low as Elijah walked away, his words echoing in his mind, leaving him hollow and defeated. For the first time, Elijah felt truly free, and for the first time, the truth was louder than prejudice. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and sunlight poured in, golden and warm, illuminating Elijah's face. He stepped out, his shoulders squared, his head held high, his eyes blinking against the brightness. It felt different, lighter, freer. But deep down, a heaviness lingered. He had won his freedom, but the judgment, the prejudice, they would follow him long after he walked away from this courthouse. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as the world outside came into focus. But the memories clung to him. The eyes that had watched him with suspicion, the whispers that had judged him guilty before they even knew his name. They saw his skin before they saw his truth. And that pain cut deeper than any accusation. Elijah's gaze drifted to the bottom of the steps, where Amanda stood, her hands trembling, her eyes wide and shining with tears. She rushed forward, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tightly, as if she could protect him from the world. Her voice broke, raw with emotion. "You did it. You really did it." Elijah hugged her back, his body sagging against hers, his chin resting on her shoulder. His chest tightened, his throat burning as he fought back tears. His voice was low, heavy with exhaustion and gratitude. "You taught me to fight. You always did." Amanda pulled back, her hands cradling his face, her eyes fierce and full of love. "They tried to break you, but they couldn't. You showed them who you are. You showed them the truth." Elijah's eyes burned, his vision blurring as he looked at her. His voice cracked. "They saw my skin, but they never saw me." Amanda's face softened, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Then make them see you. Make them see who you really are." Her words struck deep, giving Elijah a sense of purpose. He looked at her, his heart pounding, his resolve hardening. She had believed in him when no one else did. She had given him the strength to fight, to speak his truth. And now he would carry that strength with him, wherever he went. At the top of the steps, Judge Pierce stood watching, his face solemn, his eyes thoughtful. He descended slowly, his posture dignified, his gaze steady as he approached Elijah. When he spoke, his voice was low, respectful. "You've got a sharp mind, Elijah, and a heart that seeks justice. You should consider law school." Elijah's breath caught, his eyes widening in surprise. The words echoed in his mind, powerful and affirming. For so long, he had been seen as a suspect, a criminal, a stereotype. But in this moment he was seen as more, seen for his mind, his potential, his truth. A smile broke across his face, small but confident. "I've been considering it for a long time." Judge Pierce's lips curved into a slight smile, his eyes warm with approval. He reached out, his hand firm as it clasped Elijah's shoulder. "The world needs people like you, voices that can shatter prejudice and speak for justice." Elijah's heart swelled, his chest rising as he stood taller, his shoulders straightening. He looked back at Amanda, her eyes shining with pride, her face glowing with love. He felt her hand slip into his, her fingers tightening around his. He looked back at Judge Pierce, his voice steady, unwavering. "They judged my skin, but they couldn't deny my truth. Today justice stood taller than prejudice, but tomorrow I'll make them see me." Judge Pierce nodded, his respect clear, his approval unwavering. He turned and walked back up the courthouse steps, his silhouette framed against the golden light. Elijah watched him go, his chest rising and falling as he took in the scene, as he absorbed the weight of the moment. He looked at Amanda, his mother, his strength, his hope. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with love and pride, her faith in him unbreakable. He squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. He would fight, not just for himself, but for her, for everyone who had been judged before they were heard. Turning away from the courthouse, Elijah took his first step forward, his movements strong and steady. The sunlight washed over him, golden and warm, illuminating his path. He walked into the light, his head held high, his shoulders squared. He was ready to face the world, not as a suspect, not as a stereotype, but as himself. His voice was low, steady, filled with determination. "They saw my skin, but they'll remember my truth." If you believe in justice beyond prejudice, share this story. Let the world see the truth. How many others are judged before they're even heard? Subscribe for more stories that challenge injustice and inspire change.